Iran in turmoil. After decades of royal rule, millions of Iranians took to the streets. A popular movement against a regime that was seen as brutal, corrupt, and illegitimate.
As a student at the time of the revolution, there was a feeling that we were being humiliated by the Shah and his regime. Domestically, the Shah's regime was a dictatorship. There was no freedom.
Revolutionary forces under the leadership of Grand Ayatollah Homeini forced the Shah of Iran into exile. His government overthrown and replaced by a new Islamic order.
It was the people all over Iran who chose Khomeini, who wanted him as leader. Such a revolution by the people has never occurred before in history.
The Islamic Revolution would take Iran along a new path, one that brought it to war with its neighbor and led to ongoing conflict with the West, while remolding a staunchly defiant and independent nation. By the mid-70s, the Shah's ambitious development programs were costing much more than the country's oil revenues could generate. In 1977, Iran's economy collapsed. With high unemployment and soaring inflation, ordinary Iranians were bearing the brunt of the new financial crisis, and they turned their wrath against their king.
The fundamental reason he failed is precisely because of his success, in this sense. When he changed the fabric of Iranian society, he created a new middle class. He created incredible expectations in the working class. He kept telling them that they're going to live lives comparable to Germany, to Japan. So you have a middle class, you have an educated technocratic class, you have a working class that expects more and more, but you can't deliver. You can't deliver on the expectations because the expectations are so grandiose to be almost absurd.
From his exile, Khomeini continued his stinging criticism of the Shah, and his message was spreading through the mosques of Iran through a vast network of clerics.
We were transmitting the Imam's messages, statements, and speeches to Iran by telephone. We had contacts in cities in Iran. We were calling them at night and sending them the tape of the Imam's daily speeches by telephone. They would record it, and the next day, they would be distributed in meetings, ceremonies, universities, mosques all over Iran. And people were made aware of his words.
The so-called cassette revolution was underway.
Khomeini was sending cassettes denouncing government and the Shah and everything. So this was the start of the revolution. At the point, I was responsible for the Progressive Party of the Rastakhli's party, which was a unique party of Iran. And I was traveling around the country and making speeches, telling people, beware of what is going to happen to you.
But the people were not listening. In this newly charged atmosphere, it was Khomeini's message that was resonating.
They saw Khomeini as the symbol of ultimate opposition to the monarchy. There were plenty of clerics who also opposed the Shah, but they were seen as people who were willing to compromise. And Khomeini really upped all of them by saying, no, we don't want to go back to a constitutional monarchy. We want actually a completely new type of republic, an Islamic republic, without actually spelling out what that meant.
Sensing the growing influence of the outspoken cleric, the Shah decided to retaliate. In January 1978, he commissioned the writing of a stinging article attacking Khomeini very personally and had it put on the front page of Iran's largest newspaper. He grossly miscalculated the consequences.
This anonymous article went in describing Khomeini as, among others, an Indian, so, obviously not native Iranian, but also saying he was a British spy and had sort of licentious habits, and which weren't fully described, but people got the idea. And of course, this is the thing that sparked off protests, particularly in Qom.
The protests quickly spread across Iran. Throughout the year, there was an ever-growing tide of strikes and demonstrations. Yet many of the protesters had little in common, apart from their implacable opposition to the monarch.
Well, people like myself, including thousands of government employees and even factory workers, who went on strike in Iran for about 6 months and had no demand but liberty, and Iranian intellectuals who demanded democracy. None of these people went on strike for an Islamic revolution or Islamic rule or Islamic government. They wanted a secular government.
In such a volatile atmosphere, a single tragic event proved to be a tipping point. In August 1978, a fire broke out in a cinema in Abadan in southwestern Iran. 400 people were burnt to death. By now, even apparent accidents were being interpreted as having political links.
The Shah had so lost the kind of public relations propaganda war that it was widely believed that the fire was set by agents of the government. It was totally unfounded, but nevertheless, clearly this was, he had lost the publicity high ground, if you want.
There is now more than, I think, ample evidence to conclude that the clergy did this, and they did it to radicalize the movement.
But the supporters of the clerics deny this allegation.
Nonsense. Well, all that is certain is that a fire broke out in this Cinema Rex in Abadan, and the doors were locked and people could not get out. But to suppose that the Islamic movement in Iran or any of its personalities had the need of creating an atrocity in order to vilify the Shah's regime, it's just, what shall I say, infantile.
Whatever the truth, the tragedy attracted thousands more protesters to the streets. Increasingly desperate, the Shah declared martial law. Newly emboldened, his troops were soon to commit an atrocity, which became known as Black Friday, and which further loosened the ruler's grip on power. Today, Shahada Square looks like any other busy intersection in the south of the city, but it is of huge historical significance because it was here at the end of 1978 that opposition to the Shah turned from protest to open revolution.
In September, when martial law was declared in Tehran, there was a clash between demonstrators and troops. A large number of people were killed. And I think really after that, for the Shah, things began to go downhill very rapidly.
By now, protesters of all political persuasions were chanting Khomeini's name as his revolutionary rhetoric began to galvanize the various opposition groups. In a desperate attempt to silence his most outspoken critic, the Shah convinced the then Vice President of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, to expel Khomeini from the holy city of Najaf, from where he had continued to agitate against the Iranian ruler. In October 1978, Khomeini and his entourage found refuge in the small town of Neuf-le-Château, just outside Paris. But if the Shah had hoped that the expulsion would silence his nemesis, he was mistaken.
All of a sudden we went to Paris and we got a great opportunity to announce what the movement wants. That by itself influenced what is going on inside Iran.
By late 1978, it appeared that revolution was truly in the air. But even at this late stage, it was far from clear that the world was about to witness its first Islamic uprising.
Certain groups in particular rallied late and opportunistically and marginally to the cause of the revolution, in the assumption that the religious scholars, Imam Khomeini in particular, would not have the ability to govern. That, for example, the leftists made the assumption that, we are, the certified revolutionaries. We're the people that know about revolution. Let this old man motivate the masses, and then, we will claim our birthright of ruling the country.
And even the clerics themselves, many of whom had been imprisoned with other political opponents, did not seem to believe that they were the powers behind the throne.
6 months of my prison was spent with the people who became leaders of the Islamic Republic. I was in prison with Rafsanjani, Montazeri, Mahdavi, Kani, almost the whole who's who of the Republic. I was in the same cell block. I ate with them, we talked to them, I played volleyball with them on a regular daily basis. And if you had told them, or us, that exactly a year and a half from us, you guys will be the rulers of Iran, both of us, them and us, would have told you that you need to see a psychiatrist.
But the Shah was unable to lock up all of his opponents. And on the streets of Iran, the protests grew ever more vociferous. No longer were the crowds yelling, "The Shah must go." Now, the screams of "death to the Shah" had become a common refrain in the streets of Tehran.
The Shah was devastated by the revolution, and he was devastated by seeing pictures of himself being burned, and pictures of the Empress being burned in the streets. And when he finally did get to see those, when he saw the hatred of the people for the regime, he was totally devastated.
By now, almost every section of society was united in opposition to the Shah's reign.
There were people from all classes of society. I remember watching one demonstration in November from a high-rise, so you could really kind of look down on these crowds. And in some ways it was kind of astonishing to see these huge groups of people emerging from the side streets into the main avenue to join the protests. And they came in kind of packs, clearly from neighborhoods of the working class districts of Tehran. And suddenly you'd see this sea of black chadored veiled women, or the sea of working class men. But also, you had merchants from the bazaar, shopkeepers, and then eventually the middle class, began to join. The westernized middle class began to believe the revolution would be a very good thing.
Time was running out for the Shah. And as the new year dawned, his downfall seemed inevitable. On January the 16th, 1979, with the streets ablaze and his rule in tatters, the Shah fled the country, never to return. At a stroke, 2,500 years of Persian monarchy came to an end.
خروج شاه اولین مرحله پیروزی ملت ماست و ما مشکلات زیاد در پیش داریم.
The stage was set for the return of Grand Ayatollah Khomeini after 16 years in exile. 2 weeks after the Shah's departure, Khomeini and his entourage prepared to leave Paris, bound for Tehran.
We were a little nervous that they might hijack the plane and take us to an unknown place and then arrest us, because the Shah's secret police, Savak, was still in charge and active. But we were mostly thinking about the fact that we were going to be in Iran in the next few hours, and what the people's response would be like to our presence there.
But they needn't have worried. For Khomeini's supporters, waiting for him in Iran was a day they had long dreamed of, but thought they would never see.
I was one of the first people to go aboard the airplane when they landed. The Imam was sitting alone. There was no fear on his face. I had struggled from 1961 to 1979. It was a duration of 18 years of struggle. I even went to jail. I felt I was flying. I was so happy to see the struggle had come into fruition.
Journalists asked the Ayatollah what he felt returning to Iran, and he is reported to have replied, nothing. But the same could not be said of the many thousands who had protested against the Shah's regime. Suddenly, the possibilities seemed endless.
The great thing about revolution, it was not only happening in the streets, it was also happening in people's minds. Let's say from December 78 to December 79, where the Shah's regime had fallen, I mean, there was absolute freedom. Books were being translated and sold by the kilos. People suddenly had access to Marx, they had access to all these writers they couldn't read before, because of the censorship.
Khomeini quickly appointed Mehdi Bazargan, a pro-democracy activist, as interim prime minister, briefly raising hopes that the new government would reflect the wide range of voices who had united against the Shah. But for the old guard, who were perceived to be enemies of the revolution, retribution was swift and brutal. Many were imprisoned and killed, while others were forced into exile.
Around 5:30 in the afternoon, they entered into the campus, and we came out. Somebody arrested me there with a machine gun on my chest. Said, "Don't move." I told myself, this is the end of my life. I have one chance to save my skin. At one moment that he was trying to get another one, I fled. But I didn't dare to go out because I was shooting from every side. So somebody pushed me and said, "Mr. Majdi, this is the moment to go out." So I went out on the sidewalk of the street. A revolutionary group was attacking with machine guns and everything. They were shooting from inside, so they didn't pay attention to me.
Within weeks of his return, Khomeini appointed Ayatollah Khalkhali to establish a new revolutionary court to deliver Islamic rulings. Khalkhali would become known as the hanging judge. Under his direction, hundreds of former government officials and SAVAK agents were executed.
We had, in the first weeks and continuing into the first months of the revolution, drumhead trials which lasted a few minutes, often held in the middle of the night, in which ministers, military officers, members of the security services of the old regime were tried, sentenced to death, and executed. And every morning we woke up to see in the newspapers these gory pictures of bodies, with bullet holes in them, who had been assassinated the previous night.
As scores were settled with many of the Shah's extended circle, some felt that the revolution was losing its way.
The day I sort of changed perspective on the revolution was this day, this very instant when I took this photograph. These were the first four generals, one of them Nasiri, the head of the SAVAK, Rahimi, in charge of of Tehran, Khosrodad and Najib. They had been executed the night before, and they were executed after a secret trial. By we mean the nationalist element within the revolution. We wanted open trials. Because first of all, they had, we wanted them to have a chance to defend themselves.
But many of the newly empowered clergy felt that these trials were fully justified.
It wasn't just Khalkhali. He was involved in the committees to fight drugs. It was the Revolutionary Courts and the Revolutionary Council who wrote up the laws and followed them. So those people who had killed and tortured people, youngsters, and murdered on the streets, should we keep them and give them breakfast and lunch? And then what would they do?
Grand Ayatollah Montazeri was once destined to be Ayatollah Khomeini's successor as supreme leader until the two fell out. He claims that many of the court's rulings were arbitrary.
Anyway, most of them were baseless. No proper trials. They were like puppet courts. I protested, and I wrote an official letter to the imam. They'd shut the doors of the prison, and they were just executing people.
With the Shah's former supporters out of the way, and the military having declared itself neutral, the Islamic Republic of Iran was formally founded on April 1st, 1979. All the perceived symbols of Western decadence were destroyed. The reign of the Shah was over forever. But his ability to provoke opposition remained undimmed. After leaving Iran, he had sought refuge in several countries, and in October 1979, he arrived in the US for cancer treatment. The visit provoked uproar at home and set in motion a chain of events that continued to reverberate 3 decades later.
On that morning, it started to rain. I clearly remember that. And I looked out my window, and there are these young, I wouldn't say kids, but, you know, college age, 17, 18-year-olds mostly, with posters of Khomeini, and some of them with clubs in their hands, climbing over the gate in droves. And the first thing that I realized is that they started to head toward my office, which is only maybe 50 yards away.
Our first aim was to bring the Shah back from America. But of course we knew it was unlikely to happen. But all protests are like that. We thought it would last 3 to 5 days.
But instead, a hostage crisis unfolded that was to endure for 444 days. By the time it was over, US President Jimmy Carter had been voted out of office. The Islamic Republic of Iran had been firmly established, and the two nations, previously so close, would become the staunchest of enemies.